Welcome to Modern Mythology, a podcast that explores the many intersections of story and system. For more information about this episode, articles, or links to our other related projects, visit modernmythology.net.
All right, so the first and foremost important piece of this conversation is, what alignment are you? Go ahead, real quick, just tell me, Sean.
Chaotic good, of course.
Well, I will say that I most enjoy playing chaotic good and lawful evil
But
characters.
what are you?
Neutral.
I would certainly say that I probably teeter on lawful neutral. You know, I tend towards lawful.
I mean, I see myself as chaotic good, but of course that's the problem we'll get into. I'm doing this for good reasons, obviously.
So according to the first meme that I just picked up,
Yes.
I am V from Vendetta in chaotic good. Lawful neutral, you are Captain Picard
Right.
as lawful neutral.
I don't hate that.
Yeah. And Jimmy, would you say chaotic evil?
No, neutral.
Chaotic evil? Oh, all right. Let's see how it is.
Chaotic neutral?
Chaotic good / lawful evil.
Well, lawful evil is my favorite on this meme because that is Darth Vader.
Yeah.
I don't see, you're not really Vader, though.
No, I'm not lawful. I enjoy playing lawful evil characters a lot, but I'm not myself that way at all. Which is why I enjoy it.
I think this is going to be a great conversation because we get to dig into alignment.
Yeah.
And there's a bunch of reasons why this is interesting. First off, because alignment does have its roots in sort of storytelling and this idea of like axiomatic behavioral pieces and driving player narrative, and
That's the idea.
Right, that's the idea, right? But consequently, you have 3 philosophy majors who get to talk about good and evil.
Yeah.
That's right.
Beforehand, I was saying it's funny, like studying moral philosophy, because I actually took a bunch of classes that were bundled together as anti-moral philosophy at
Right.
Harvard. So,
Which makes total sense why we're having this conversation. So I'm sure we've all taken the quizzes and seen the various, like you said, the various fictional characters and what they are.
And line you up to one of the 9.
Aligning you to one of the 9. When you think of like alignment memes, what do you think of? Do you have any favorite alignment memes?
oh my God, I've seen so many of them. They kind of all blur together. I mean, for me, the main thing is just that it is primarily a meme format, and like it's a way of, categorizing things in that way. But it doesn't, I've seen like memes that like categorize the alignments of a character in like a particular show.
Yeah.
But then they'll completely contradict each other, and that's like one of those things that's a good example of it, right?
Yeah. Do you have any favorite memes?
Well, yeah, it's kind of that same thing of taking, unlike the one we just went through where it's characters from different shows or movies and putting them together. But I like putting the characters from the same show and that gives you a bit of perspective.
Right. You should get like 3 or 4 that are actually fairly good fits, and the other ones that kind of like, well, you have to put them somewhere.
Right.
So,
Well, and I also think that it's, as a writer, have you, I'm pretty certain I know the answer to this question, but have you ever like assigned alignments for a story, like specifically? I didn't think so. I definitely have. Like as for the structure, right? For the, how this character is moving through the world, certainly when I was younger. You and I are definitely archetype people.
I do work from archetypes in a way, but
I think in that term, and of course, alignment is about those sort of archetypes in a large degree.
And I do think as much as I'm going to be talking against it in some ways in this show, I do think if you don't take it too literally, it can be a really good way to get a sense of a character or an idea and kind of map it into like that grid and have that system behind it. I think that can be useful. It's just as soon as you try to take it literally, as soon as you try to formalize it, it gets weird. Something doesn't quite fit, and you got to move that over there, and then
So I have to say that as erudite as I like to think of myself, the reality is that I do get a little tickle whenever I see the alignment memes or like what class you are. Like, I don't know, it's in our, I'm not a big D&D fan even, but it's like in our gaming DNA.
Sure.
You know what I mean? I almost said gaming D&D. It's in our gaming
That's how
DNA.
ingrained it is.
Right. And we've all engaged with it on like, various levels. Right?
Sure.
And so we're going to talk a little bit about sort of the history of alignment in D&D, how various books have used alignment. And we're going to then really sort of dig into sort of the philosophy of alignment. When I would start this, my inclination would be, let's define them. But I sort of feel like part of your argument is that to some degree they're indefinable, like they're harder to nail down than we would.
Well, I wanted to say that they're shorthand. I mean, when you guys are talking about,
exactly.
Building a character in a narrative or in a novel like you do, you're going to be thinking about the background, and you're going to be thinking about how they got to the point where other people perceive them as being evil based off of where they're at now. But I think in the context of the game, I think the intent was, how do you start with the alignment in order to make judgments about either the player characters and what decisions they are making, and especially the NPCs and the enemies. Again, a shorthand way of saying, well, X is lawful evil, and so therefore it is an enemy.
Right, and a way for there to be repercussions. I mean, that's one thing I do remember is that from playing first edition AD&D, I think is even by that point, like if it'd be like, well, if you make this choice, you're going down an evil path, and you can't be that class anymore. You can't use that item anymore, or those. It was very kind of restrictive in that way, and I think that was kind of what drove it in play. A lot of times in my memory was, I mean, there was certainly the element of like choosing your alignment to fit into a class or whatever, but it came up more when it was like, oh, I can't burn that village to the ground because I can't be a paladin anymore, or whatever. Right. When you're a kid, like that's kind of like
So. Let's just start. You mentioned first edition,
right?
But now alignment really harkens back to both Moorcock, a couple of Moorcock's contemporaries, as well as Glorantha, with this idea of law and chaos, right? So, and it's funny because we're going to start with cosmological and end with cosmological, right? Because it started with this cosmological idea of, do you follow the gods of law? Do you follow the gods of chaos?
There's almost like a kind of Taoist element to it too, where it wasn't really supposed to be good and evil. It was very much like these two principles that are like opposing it, inseparable, right? Like it had that Taoist element to it. It was kind of cool.
Now, in a lot of games, this sort of manifests in very obvious ways. So Warhammer and DCC and a number of others, to some degree, you could say like chaos is the more fun, right? Chaos is the partier of the alignments because they get the crazy stuff.
Well, and you're concerned about personal freedom more than you're concerned about kind of not being limited by societal
following the
norms.
rules,
but not in that original
the early
source
form.
material.
You're right. No, you're right. Yeah.
In the original source material, you definitely got the sense that chaos was evil, right? And I don't know if the audience heard the heavy air quotes in my evil, but they were not only often the bad guys, but it was a corruptive force, right? If you look up the books in Warhammer, which is interestingly one of the earliest foundational gaming companies in our hobby, is Games Workshop and all its predecessors, and this idea of these gods of chaos, these demons, right? And what if you worship them, and then in stuff like DCC, when you cast spells and things like that, you ostensibly manifest chaos, right?
Yeah. I don't know too much of the Warhammer lore, so that's interesting. I didn't know that it was that grounded in it.
Yeah, and law was like not as interesting. Like, you definitely got people who aimed for it because they wanted their characters to look a certain way and not change, which I think is kind of an interesting thing we can talk about when we dive deeper in, because there are these interesting like psychological pieces to the whole puzzle as to why we play these various alignments. So early on, it was just law and chaos, and then we got the famous 9, right? You have law and chaos and good and evil, and then
neutrality on both axes.
Neutrality on both axes, which is sort of trying to dance in the middle. Right. And you were talking about first edition, what do you remember about the most prominent way that alignment was applied in first edition?
I mean, like I said, it was usually through in actions that would change your alignment, but it was also didn't you lose levels or something if you changed alignment? There was something to that too, if I remember correctly.
Yes, but I want to start with classes,
right?
And what classes were restricted to certain alignments.
Paladin obviously was the premier one that was not only restricted in that way, but also with you had to have the best ability scores in a lot of other things to be a paladin. It was very
Yep. So you had to be lawful good as a paladin.
Right.
You had to be lawful as a monk.
That's right.
I think you had to be, what was it, non-good as a thief, if I remember correctly. You could be neutral.
Probably.
But I think it was non-good, if I remember correctly. And then, you got into these, like you said, restrictions.
Right. And they loved it. I mean, first edition and still in second edition, losing levels was such a common thing.
Oof.
And energy drain, alignment changes, things like that. You're like, oh my God.
That was an interesting design piece that somewhere in about the 90s,
I never loved it.
No one did. So it turned out that design-wise, taking things away that you've earned is a not fun thing unilaterally.
Yeah, pretty much.
So they've tried to figure out how to do energy drain over decades, and it changes more and more to be because remember,
temporary,
at one point in time, it was a penalty XP sink.
Right.
So it's not so much that you lost a level, but you couldn't, gain that XP, for a level kind of deal.
In second edition, so for alignment, when you were getting out of sync with whatever your character class was supposed to be. So this is for the paladin, but also for clerics. So if your cleric was aligned to the deity, you would have to have the same alignment.
Have the same alignment.
And then if the DM determined that you were taking actions that were counter to that alignment and, was tracking that.
Go out of touch with your god.
Yeah, you would end up getting penalties. So -1 to attack. You would get loss of spells. Yeah, this is second edition.
For clerics?
Yeah.
Well, clerics, right. That alignment to your god was a whole thing. For both paladins and clerics, you know?
And there would be a percentage of failure. So you'd have to roll a percentage die on casting the spell or when you went to memorize the spell.
Oh,
to pray for the spell.
Praying for the spell.
So you'd have to roll.
Because then you'd have to do atonements, right? Or something to that effect. You'd have to you'd have to do a quest or something.
For the paladin, for sure.
Paladin to get it back.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that stuff is neat. I think it's kind of interesting. And I appreciate that they stripped that sort of stuff away. But some of it, I feel like they stripped it away for the same reason they stripped away class restrictions from different races. Because they feel like your game, you can have whatever restrictions you want.
At least for, this is maybe not a surprise, but even in second edition, the first thing I would do usually was find some restriction and then find the reason why a character goes against that restriction, but it makes sense for the character, and use that as a character hook. I mean, and like, it was funny because I played a character similar to Driz Jordan before. I encountered Driz Jordan, but it's the same thing. You know, like, I'm playing a dark elf who's gone against his people.
I call it the orc paladin.
Right, exactly.
The Driz is axiomatic, and orc paladin is axiomatic.
Right, exactly, yeah.
So I think that, you know, one of the first ways they started diverging from this is to think about different ways to make paladins of different alignments. So ostensibly the Cavalier ended up being kind of a neutral, kind of agnostic.
There was a Dragon magazine, I think, early on, which had like all different alignments.
And then of course the anti-paladin.
Right, sure, yeah.
But then the idea...
The lawful evil.
The lawful evil.
The Darth Vader.
And then, was it lawful evil or catechism?
I think it was lawful.
Yeah, it was lawful.
Because the paladin still had that lawful nature.
Right.
You could be for an evil purpose, or selfish purpose, or just an evil deity,
or Lord Soth.
Soth, right. But I think eventually they stripped it away because these were interesting character choices that you could do exactly what you're saying and say, hey, what does your paladin think?
Right? Exactly,
And I think there's also, you know, the paladin is probably the most infamous example of this, in terms of, I think most of us have had experiences where our paladin, like our culture shifted, because I think we started to see the paladin as the bad guy.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this is one of the things I was thinking of getting into ultimately, about the trouble of interpretation with alignments, and like the fact that, you know, it becomes very squiggly in terms of like the character thinks they're good, this person thinks they're bad, this other person thinks they're good. Where is the arbiter of that? I mean, obviously in a game sense, the arbiter of that is the DM. But like, you know, if you're trying to think about it more in like a diegetic, like within the world sort of sense, you know.
And, you know, like even if you think about the D&D cartoon, now granted, he was a cavalier. I don't think he was a paladin, as I think about it.
Right, yeah.
With the guy with the shield. He was like kind of a coward, right? But this idea of what is lawful good, right? And to some degree, like Batman Year One is like playing with this, right? It's the idea of like, you would see Superman as lawful good.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
Certainly.
But what happens when the law changes and you see rhetoric based on law is good, when you interpret the idea of law being good.
Right.
But I don't want to get too much into that.
Right. We can go into the whole like Batman like is beating up poor people who are mentally ill and putting them in the asylum. Yeah.
But then going back to the determination in your player characters of alignment and how that impacted how they were expected to play that character. I mean, don't you think that was sort of a predecessor to the character traits that, you know, that would come later?
Ideals, bonds,
flaws, right? Like that was a way, again, a shorthand way of sort of giving guidance to, okay, this is how you should play this character, and the DM's going to give you the hints that, hey, wait a minute, you're not playing that alignment, you know, and this is what that alignment should look like. And that's what would prompt the conversations that I like, that we were having back then about what does it mean to be lawful good, like you're saying, like what are the characters that are lawful good? You know, like we were creating those memes, you know, back then, but long before there were memes, you know, of like, you know, identifying with these things. You know, Robin Hood is the chaotic good character. And then that's, you know, and then you think about, okay, I'm playing a character that's like that. And then neutral, which I thought always got into some really good conversations too, because
neutral is one that people have a hard time wrapping their head around.
Neutral, and true neutral.
Like what it means is very kind of tricky, because if you're like trying to be too literal with it, like a neutral character, like isn't a character, like a non-entity, because they don't want to act. They don't want to.
They don't. Right. You get analysis paralysis.
Right. Yeah.
Or you get into that weird, like, IOU sort of situation where it's like, all right, I did something bad. Now I have to do something
Right.
good.
Like
I did something awful. Now I have to do something
Two-Face a neutral character? Right?
That was the true neutral of like the balance, right?
Yeah.
So if the good side starts to get more powerful, then the true neutral character is going to join the alliance of the evil group, and then they're going to switch sides when the other one gets to, because they believe that there should be a balance in the world ultimately, in the cosmology. Yeah.
Personally, my experience has been that for good or ill, and at the time when
You mean for good or evil?
no, ill. At the time, it annoyed me because I was lawful neutral. They generated more conversation at the game table than I really wanted. Because like we'd have these conversations about.
I remember really enjoying having those. I was like a young philosophy student, so of course I wanted to.
And I like those conversations. I just didn't want them at the game table. I guess my first question is for you guys: did you? In your history, and please let me know if it changed, right? I mean, all of us have been playing for decades.
Yeah.
In our history, did it change how you managed alignment, if you managed alignment? And more importantly, was there a prescriptive or was it descriptive? Right?
Definitely descriptive. My default for everything is descriptive over prescriptive, and there are exceptions, obviously, but they're few. So definitely descriptive. But I did use it. I mean, especially the only thing that was, kind of showing some of my issues with it inherently was that so many of my characters were with tendencies, chaotic good with neutral tendencies, neutral with good tendencies. It's always this sort of, because it's, the sort of range of behaviors that they might do in different circumstances that don't seem confined within the one, kind of box.
I'm going to get back to that. That's really interesting.
And I, have always used it. I mean, I consider it a pretty important element to the player characters. In terms of, when you're making a D&D character, what is your alignment? Why is that your alignment? And the personality traits, just contribute to that as, we've moved on in additions. But I've always considered it to be an important factor when you're thinking about designing the character, whether it's a paladin or cleric or wizard or some of these things where alignment's important. But even, for a fighter or, a sorcerer where these things could be open. Right, exactly.
Why are they fighting?
And then explain to the player that that's going to be an important element in their role playing. Where it's changed for me, and I think maybe for role-playing as a whole, is how it pertains to enemies, right? Because I think, in the olden days, it was a crutch for us to utilize the fact that
these things are evil.
These things are evil,
all
right?
All of them are evil.
The chromatic dragons are evil, right? Like there are none that are good. They're if they're chromatic, if they're
murder at will,
red, blue, green, white or black, they're going to be.
I mean,
evil.
that was one of the things about the lawful good potentially being evil is like lawful good is convinced that they're doing the good thing, but that means you have to get rid of all the evil, and that so happens that the things they consider evil are all the gnomes or whatever it is, And
I think all of that wouldn't have been so bad if it wasn't for one spell or ability.
What's that?
Detect. Right? Because how the fuck would you know? Right? Other than race, right? Which has its own problem, right? If the idea is that...
Well, tying it to race, it's definitely problematic.
Someone who looks like a gnoll, kill it.
Yeah,
right.
And well, it works, right?
Sean, I want to go back to your. So, descriptive or prescriptive? Was it something about the character that started the character and really didn't change? In other words, it restricted how the player could behave, or was it descriptive and the player could do anything.
But it's describing what you did.
Yeah, I mean, it was intentionally prescriptive, prescriptive, just because then I wanted to see the character played that way.
Right, and that's interesting.
And that you stick to that alignment. Now, if there was a change in alignment, there was a discussion, as we all know, like I like to play Dragonlance, and Dragonlance had a lot of that embedded into the different character classes.
Right? I mean, Soth was obvious, but Kitiara was dancing that line.
Right.
Yeah, well, the wizards. I mean, there's three different color wizards. A white wizard is a good wizard. A red robe wizard is a neutral wizard.
Right.
And a black robe was,
doesn't Raceland change?
Yeah, he started red and went black. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was based off of how they evolved over time. But if you wanted to remain a red wizard, you would have to remain neutral, and your character would have to act neutral.
So, either of you ever have as a GM or a player, and I'm sure the answer is yes, because it's been many, many, many years, but a character who changed alignment?
Oh, yeah.
And how big of a deal was it? Was it just like and I don't mean, when I say change in alignment, I don't mean prescriptive, because you're saying all your stuff is descriptive, and most of yours was prescriptive. For prescriptive, I'm not talking about like, oh, I made a mistake, he really should be this. I'm talking about like there was a philosophy change in the character. Was it a big deal in the story?
Yeah, I mean, usually it's led by the story. It's led by the thing that's happening, and then this is the descriptive thing, obviously, but like then the alignment changes because their behavior has changed. I'm trying to think of an example I can give that isn't explain the whole campaign and everything. That's always a problem with giving examples, with your past characters or whatever.
Oh God, especially with alignment, to be like, what's the context by which they went from good to evil?
Yeah, exactly.
Besides a switch on their back.
Yeah. So I have one, and I've characterized it as a mistake that I won't repeat, and we've talked about it before in terms of this is one of the longer campaigns that I did with my group of friends back in middle school, and I had one of the player characters evolve into the big bad behind their back.
That's fun.
It
could be really cool,
seemed like it would be a lot of fun.
Right.
I got the chance to meet with my one buddy, and we devised what they were doing in the background. And then when we would play the sessions, the person they were chasing after was actually the player character was right next to him. Right. And then we got to the last scene and divulged, oh, by the way, so-and-so is actually the big bad. And because he's been doing things on the side, he's a few levels above you guys.
Right.
And then they had to do PvP.
Right.
And it did not go well,
especially for that age.
Were really hurt feelings,
actual relationships.
Yeah, for that age, I can see that being tricky.
And he wiped out the party.
He did. Oh wow! And that's sort of tough because, I'm sure all of us have different opinions. We'll have an entire episode about death, but and the idea then about the players win or player agency or whatever the case is, you're in a tough spot because is this now an NPC run by a player, or is this a PC that has their own agenda? That's because
I've definitely had. I mean, I ran a campaign where that sort of scenario kind of went down. It didn't turn into a PvP thing. But we were also much older. I think that's a big factor. I also had a D&D character where they kidnapped all the other PCs, basically to get them to fight and hopefully take over the thieving guild that she wanted to take over by having them kidnapped, quote unquote, by that guild. They had little tokens or whatever that keyed them off that it was this guild, and she
took away their agency just for the sake of.
She's and she was a lawful evil character, speaking of.
Yeah, and let's not forget the problems and the PR involved in the Ubiquitous Evil campaign. Right? It's playing villains is problematic. It's something that I think I was into when I was really young. I think complicated characters now can be interesting.
Right. I mean, the anti-hero is kind of the quintessential American hero. Isn't the lawful good paladin? It's at best chaotic good.
Right.
Yeah.
it's interesting that there was that culture shift where back in the day, Superman was the axiomatic American hero. And
or at least
then,
how America saw itself.
Right. And then once you got into, I've done, and I'm not saying this out of hubris, I'm just saying like, I've done a lot of research in terms of like the culture of comics and seeing how that changed. And I can see how those shifts happened in terms of cinema, in terms of gaming and so on and so forth. Where Wolverine, there's a reason Wolverine became this sort of icon, what we felt was like a real value shift between lawful good and chaotic good, or even, chaotic neutral to some degree.
Yeah.
My first character was chaotic neutral. My very first character was chaotic neutral.
Chaotic neutral or chaotic stupid?
So definitely chaotic neutral.
Okay.
He was all into freedom. He was all into like agency.
Yeah. Arguably Han Solo starts out as a
Now, when I was 8, I did not know the word agency.
Sure.
So I can't say I was but I just didn't like, I was kind of I'm very religious. I was kind of goody two shoes when I was a kid.
That's funny. I didn't know that.
Yeah. And so like, this was a departure for me. This was a way for me to kind of be that rogue,
right?
Kind of.
Sure. That's probably why I play lawful evil characters sometimes.
Right. But we do go back to what I was saying. We do understand that there is a PR problem with D&D being okay with a group that's going to be evil, right?
Sure.
And
the quintessential murder hobo.
Right. Yeah. And granted, that's what most RPGs devolve into.
That's the joke, is that you start out trying to be a hero, and then by the end of either the campaign or the first adventure, depending on the group, like you burn down the village and, whatever it is. Like, well, we weren't trying to cause war crimes, but this thing happened and that thing happened, and it made sense at the time to cast the fireball, and, well, things happen.
I want to put a pin there, too, in the evil campaign, because, I had a lot of sort of issues and thoughts about it at the time. I had always promoted or had to promote D&D as being, well, it's a hero's adventure. You're taking the side of good versus bad, and it is what you make of it.
We aren't worshiping Satan. Yeah.
Right. Well, and that was what I was railing against. Again, playing in the 80s.
Right. Yeah.
I had, family members, let's say, people in the house, my stepmom, who ultimately, bought into the satanic panic and the just sort of the stigma around what these games were.
Thank you, Jack.
Yeah. And so so I had to very specifically say, this is what we're doing, and then again, very specifically, when it came time to, all right, let's do this. Let's set up an evil campaign. And that's why, one of the reasons why I like alignment, because it does put you into, okay, you have to be thoughtful about what that means, and then how do you play that role? And the whole point of role playing is the fact that you get to play something different than you. I always tell players that
do only self-insert.
When you make a character,
safe environment, right? You hope that if it's done and it's done well, that everybody, that we're laughing at this, we're not, that we're not serious, where we don't want to, torture animals and so on and so forth. And many of us probably weren't playing evil, in
most of the evil characters or campaigns usually were like thieves, and it was usually much more of like sort of breaking the law kind of evil. And sometimes you would do things that were at best morally gray, but it's still, can't think of a time we played characters where it was like, we're just going to go in and murder this family.
Right. Or you're in alignment with the evil deities, and so you're doing necromancy, and undead and things like that.
Necromancy is a good one.
Naturally, evil.
I think torture ends up being an interesting conversation.
Sorry. That's the way you said it. Torture is an interesting,
Let's try torture. No, it's just the idea of that's how a lot of fiction, and then of course games, you make them a little uncomfortable, but like the ends justify the
Right.
means kind of idea. And it's like, well, again, he thinks what he's doing is okay.
Well, this is another thing. I mean, is that like, I think sometimes evil characters can be a problem because people then use the evil as an excuse, where the character doesn't really have a motivation. It's just, he does it because he's evil.
Right.
That's not a motivation, you know?
Right.
And I think that can be where that problem kind of arises, you know?
I can't honestly say, unless it was the purpose of the story, like you were saying, with the turns out to be the big bad. I can't honestly say I've seen a big alignment shift, other than I've always wanted to track alignment. I've always wanted a game where their actions, I actually developed.
There are video games that kind of do that, but a tabletop is harder.
Mass Effect, I think.
Tries to. The Rebel or whatever thing.
It was Renegade and Paragon.
Right.
And and that was what I was going for in terms of like, okay, so here are very specific things that cause your alignment. And when I think about these things, often I'm thinking about them in terms of choices. So like discrete choices, not open-ended choices, but like, for instance, saying, if you do X, then you go in this direction.
Right.
If you do Y, you go in this.
Just want to throw trolley problems at the characters, right?
Right. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, I think, my answer to the question of, I've always sort of used alignment for the opposite, the same reason you're not using it, Jim.
Okay.
Right? Is because I wanted to kind of force the issue. I wanted to be like, all right, let's go like fuck alignment, but let's make alignment a thing. It's stupid, but let's make alignment a thing. I'm like between the two of you. I'm neutral.
Yeah.
So I would very actively create scenarios that would test alignment.
Right. I think for me, it's more, I do that with the character and might not define it as the alignment, but it's still like posing moral conundrums to player characters is, one of the fun things about being a GM.
Sure. But it cannot surprise you that I want to systematize.
Right. Yeah. I guess systematize the outcome more than the thing itself. But I get you.
This second edition Dragonlance, AD&D, does have a chart for tracking alignment. And so, but then it becomes the DM, and I probably enjoyed this back in the day, being the ethics police, deciding, okay, that action that you took was, on the, was bringing to evil. There's a check mark that's
you can't separate morality from interpretation. That's where we get into the philosophy.
Exactly. But then you have to track them. We talked about last time having to track the moons in the same campaign, like, as you're going through. It's just another thing that you have to track.
So now in
for all of the characters.
This is really important, right? Because the gods that are aligned to the moons care. Right?
Yeah.
Like, it affects your spell casting. It affects like a bunch of stuff, doesn't it? Your alignment, your actions,
the spells that you have access to. Again, there's penalties if you're not in alignment,
especially in 2E.
For all of those, and there's the pantheon of gods. Sort of, they all align up to that alignment. There's 5 that are good, 5 that are neutral, 5 that are evil. And
with Dragonlance, I think it's important to understand how strong Weiss and Hickman were aligning to the old chaos and law model. Because Takesis or, Tiamat, Tiamat and Takesis are the same thing.
Basically.
And Bahamut and what was
Paladine
are the same thing. And what they were actively doing was having you run that. And, since all of the dragons are aligned to particular alignments, then it was a structure by which they were telling.
And it was very prescriptive, and it was very, it involved in the novels and things like that. And I hesitate to get into it because I don't know a lot about it, but I know more recently, with Weiss and Hickman, as they've been getting into 5e and being asked to make new material.
Right.
My understanding is that they've come into conflict with some of the
I've seen some articles about
executives
that. Yeah.
where they're being asked to make alterations based off of some of those assumptions that I don't know if it was around the dragons or around the ogres or the orcs or the Dergor, right, the evil dwarves versus the drow and those kind of things, which I think people have rightful concerns about, like, well, the dark skinned ones are evil and the light skinned ones are good, and they maintained a lot of that kind of fantasy trope.
Sure.
And then they ran into the conflict as time went on that
Well, it makes as much or even more sense for them to be albino and be completely white. So I did that sometimes too.
Right.
Dark elves, but because they're caves, exactly.
The cave elves. Yeah. That's interesting, right? And the problem there often runs along good and evil, right? Because law and chaos, I feel like, is more interpretive, which is funny. I mean, I'm not saying good and evil's not interpretive, but because I don't want to get into that conversation quite yet, but like,
crack open my Nietzsche.
But law and chaos seems, it's just interesting to be like, you have law and you have criminals, right?
Well, there's so many interpretations of what those things mean, and also like the law in terms of like what the law of the land is, but then the law of the land could be completely corrupt.
Right.
But then it's kind of trying to make it more not universal, kind of universal, where it's like the order of like the universe. It's not like the order of this particular country.
Yes.
Doesn't that create its own problems? So.
And when you were talking about sort of that original dichotomy of law and chaos, I was also thinking of the Tolkien mythology, and I think that would probably more be described as light and darkness. But there wasn't other intermediaries, right? It was just sort of those two sides, and sort of battling it out in his mythology. I think it was very similar in that.
And it is interesting because it really, in a lot of those ways, it really is about taking sides more so than about how you act.
So, and Ahura Mazda and Angrimayu.
Yes.
The Zoroastrian version of Tolkien. But.
Yes. and I think that is sort of an important thing to remember, in that, like, if you're going to use alignment, it might be useful when we talk about the cosmology towards the end. Mm-hmm. It might be useful to understand it more in terms of what team are you on?
Right.
Because World of Warcraft is a good example. Like, I think they did a really good job in, like, yes, the humans are going to see the orcs as quote unquote evil, right? But that's because they have a very different lifestyle. They're nomadic. They're not really interested. But if you look at them, and actually I think, the movie was actually way more interesting than it had any right to be.
That was Bowie's son, wasn't it?
Yeah. Because they played with that pretty significantly, and the idea of, like, you see these guys as evil, but they're not evil. They might have played with the whole noble savage thing a little bit too much, but then you understand what the real evil is and why it's evil in the movie.
And then playing off the audience's expectation.
Right.
Which I think where some of this, ends up going too, where you can, introduce that, and I've done this, that black dragon, and then have the players then sort of make that assumption, but then how do you turn that on them?
So we kind of talked about our experiences, right, and our history. Let me just talk very briefly about a couple games and a couple different ways that this has been managed over time. We talked about DCC. DCC uses law and chaos. And I'm only going to talk about things that have alignment, are generally like from D&D, some sort of D&D spin-off or hack or whatever the case is. Lords of Melnibone, as you mentioned, Elric used law and chaos, and that was actually really important. And again, all of those pieces end up being about, like, it's more about chaos. It's more about, are you chaotic, and what happens to you if you become chaotic.
Right.
There were bonuses for being lawful because they were like, we have to give them something, But it was, again, I think that really comes down to this interesting like player personalities, why you play these things. There were a number of different, Sean and I were talking in the car about like the carrot and stick, right? So you have a couple systems that would give you bonuses for acting in your alignment, XP awards, that kind of stuff.
Right, rather than penalizing. Yeah.
Instead of the stick, which was you get penalties if you're acting against your alignment kind of idea. And it's interesting because I wonder how much that fed into the idea of there's this trope of the power gamer, right? And it's like, okay, well, I'm not going to play a paladin because I can't do these optimal things.
Right.
Right. And not really thinking about the story, not really, don't get me wrong. A lot of people aren't playing this to tell a tale, right? They're playing it to roll dice and play a game. And that's
well, they're focused on their character and that's.
Or they're just focused on the numbers. They're just focused on,
I mean, I think I might have said this before, but it's always interesting to me that like, it's always been a thing where like we're playing a role-playing game, so the main motivation, like I feel like I've accomplished something if I'm going against doing the optimal thing and this is in like the rules thing, because my character is motivated to do something else. It's like that sort of push up from the character itself, Yeah,
I also think that it's interesting to create your character in opposition to your own personality. It gives you the opportunity. And usually with new players, I'll say, you can really design your character one of two ways. One is, try and create that ideal hero that you would like to be. What does that look like? But on the other hand, take sort of the opposite of everything that you would normally be comfortable with or that you consider yourself and go ahead and dive into those opposites of what you would normally do.
Yeah.
I'm curious, though, you mentioned other games, because I don't know, and that some of them have, like, sort of the dichotomy of good and evil, light and dark, those kind of things. Can you think of any games that have the complexity of at least 9 or more types of different sort of alignments or an axes, similar to D&D that, you could describe your character in those terms?
That has systemic things or
built into
it. I think really some of what we were talking, there are a number of games that are like fantasy heartbreakers that came along later on that really did lean into what alignment each thing was, and so you would have hobbits were this alignment and or like they would pick one of the axes and a race or a class, right, would go in those sort of directions.
Boxes.
It would just create these, those boxes.
But there are some systems then that sort of reproduce the 9 different alignments or...
and I'm only talking, when we talk about alignment, I'm only really talking about the alignment, right? I'm only talking about D&D and D&D spin-offs, There are a number of different companies that did morality mechanics.
Right.
White Wolf is probably the most famous.
But most of them usually do it and they frame it differently. It's virtue and vice, or it's.
I'm talking more in terms of, so they did humanity is what vampires started with.
Right.
But then each of the different monsters had their own sort of humanity stat. But then they did something really interesting where the Sabbat, then their humanity was totally different. And then they had like tenets and like what you would or would not do. So you had these beings who were outside of humanity. They still led their lives in certain ways, and to me that was much more interesting.
Definitely. What's more of a belief? It's beliefs kind of more than...
because
it's a different moral theory. I mean, because all what we're talking about is that the ontology of you've got rules to follow in order to be a certain alignment.
Right.
That's more virtue-based, right? That's the classic Greek of identifying this virtue, and that's that's what term, as long as I adhere to that virtue, then I'm acting in a good...
One of the earliest Dragon magazines was vows for paladins, where they can like take these vows and like
Right.
get these like cool powers from, taking vows. I think playing paladins, if you weren't a complete asshole, was the fun thing was understanding what your tenets were, understanding what you would or wouldn't do.
Right. And now they have oaths and kind of do a similar thing with that. Right. Yeah.
And if we're missing stuff, by all means, please, send us a message, come on the Discord, talk about your favorite alignment story or like system.
Tell us why we're wrong so we can tell you why you're wrong.
Tell Jamie why it's wrong.
Right, exactly.
This might be a good opportunity to tell you where I think one of my favorite depictions of alignment and how things can change on its head, of course, harkening back to Dragonlance and the mythology, is the story of Istar and the King Priest. Because as much as, Hickman and Weiss were adhering to the tropes of alignment and things like that, one of the defining characteristics of Dragonlance is usually when you start, 350 years prior to you starting, there was a great cataclysm.
Right.
Well, the story about why that cataclysm came about was because there was a lawful good civilization in the city-state of Istar that was led by the king priest that had a number of clerics that were all in alignment with the good deities and lawful good and wanting sort of that faction to win over, all of the evil monsters and factions that were in the world, and they started winning. I mean, they ultimately, got to the point where they were sort of taking over and reducing the population of creating a theocracy. And then even with the humanoid species, mainly the humans, then the clerics would use detect thoughts and detect evil, right, to go around and police the morality of the people and said, aha, you are in fact evil, or I can detect your evil thoughts and then start carrying out justice. And so the fact that they were lawful good was sort of their motivating factor. But then the deities were like, oh man, this is getting out of balance, going back to the true neutrality, right? And saying, oh, wait a minute, if we don't intervene here, our world's going to be destroyed by this civilization. So they ultimately...
And so then the good gods then, to be good, murdered a bunch of people by raining a mountain of fire down upon them.
As is the story in religious mythology, right? It's got to happen at least once.
Right.
But yeah, ultimately, I mean, all of the deities, I think, got together and said, okay, we need to hit the restart button. Let's just hurl a giant mountain of rock down onto the planet, reshaping the planet and killing half the population and sending them into centuries of darkness. But I thought that was a good turn on that, and also to think then, again, just about how, okay, lawful good, you can be both lawful and on the side of what you think is good, and it ultimately turn in a way that I guess bends evil, but
it's the horseshoe theory of D&D alignments.
Yeah. and at the end of the story, the king priest does lose his spell casting capability. The priests lose their spell. That was supposed to be a warning to them, and the mythology of Lord Soth comes out of that as well, because he was given an opportunity to redeem himself in the same context. So but I thought
just leaned into it. Well, and this idea that this idea is like, what is my the Spaceballs quote, like, evil will always win because
good is dumb.
Because good is dumb. And it's true. Like the idea of like you motherfuckers are so easy to lure into we just have to change the words. And quite honestly, like, I don't want to get too political, but we see that now. You just change the words to align with what they think.
If you want to know what a bill is actually doing, just take what they say it is. It's the opposite of that.
Whatever the name of it is, it's doing the exact opposite.
Women's Freedom Act. Oh God.
It's doing what we assume is the opposite, but they're trying to say that's freedom to them, right? That leads us into the problem with alignment.
Right. Yeah. Problem of interpretation. Right.
I do want to say, since you brought the movie quote, my favorite is from Hackers. There is no good and evil. There's only fun and boring.
That's law and chaos.
I mean, there is this. I think that is one of like the there's this idea that, like, you know, having fun is
It's evil.
is evil,
Is fun
right?
evil? Question.
I mean, it's at least chaotic, right? And I've always like pushed against that kind of idea. But then it like feels pathetic when you're like, lawful people can be fun too.
But there is a selfishness to it, right? I mean, go back to chaotic neutral and the issues that brought up when a character wanted to be chaotic neutral, because it was basically their right, then gave them the ability to be crazy. Right. And do evil things, not for the sake of being evil, but just for the sake of doing things randomly, you know, or, you know.
It's the Malkavian alignment.
Yeah.
You chaotic stupid or chaotic crazy, right?
Yeah.
Which basically means the exact same thing. And this idea that I can be random. And usually like instigators or players who want to kind of get their fun from being disruptive will do that sort of stuff.
Although I was just thinking there was a wizard character in a campaign I played in who did almost kind of the the Batman villain thing where they're flipping a coin, except that he did it with a die, where basically he would like decide based on rolling a die. And I was so annoyed by it at first, but it did kind of work in the context of D&D. But as a character thing, it's kind of like, what person would like roll a die to determine what they do. He's chaotic neutral and he's that random. It's actually determined by the die.
So like Old Country for Old Men, don't put that quarter in your pocket, because then it'll just be a quarter,
right?
Which it is.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think chaotic neutral is probably the hardest alignment to play. Again,
depends on how you interpret it. Because like I said, Han Solo starts out kind of as a chaotic neutral character. And he murders a guy in a bar. The first thing he's defending himself, but he's a criminal. Right, yeah, exactly.
Depends on the version.
By the end of even the first movie, he's basically chaotic good, right? But he starts out kind of chaotic neutral. He doesn't really want to help them. He doesn't like want to do evil, but he's like, I'm out for myself.
Right.
So, I mean, that's right. And here we start to get into interpretation, right? This is going to be the exciting part of our show.
Perhaps.
But real quick, before we get into that, did anybody ever require the players to be a certain alignment or exclude alignment?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
I, by and large, even now, require players to play heroes. I'm not interested in about 50 to 60% of my
funny because I almost never play heroes. I've played in your games.
50 to 60% of my games.
It's a challenge of your players, right? Every single one of them.
I start with saying, we're heroes. We're not playing the bad guys. We're not doing PvP.
Right, and that's the other challenge. You got a lawful good character, and you got a neutral, evil character.
Right, and back when I played alignments, and had that kind of the driving force in like D&D, there was definitely like, I don't think I ever made it explicit because I didn't have to, but like no one could play chaotic evil. Because you can't play with others. You can't play well with others, Lawful evil, if you play lawful evil right, you can play well with others. As long as you're kind of motivated by the same thing,
Right. Loki is ostensibly lawful. Oh, no, it's chaotic evil now.
Well, yeah. Well, he's kind of chaotic neutral /
He's kind of chaotic neutral. He's kind of chaotic neutral.
Yeah.
Well, because then he becomes a hero, and then that's like
here we go with interpretation.
Right. What are trickster gods? That becomes like the really interesting, because they're doing it what they think is good, right? But
it's supposed to be character motivation in a way, the alignment system, but it also tries to fix characters, and I think that's another, at least, implicit problem with it, where it's, take Loki, for example, and he has an arc where he goes from, let's say, chaotic evil to chaotic neutral, possibly even to chaotic good, but in certain systems, he'd be penalized for that. Whereas if you want change in a character, part of why you're playing a character or running a role-playing game is to have your characters change over time. That's one of the signs of them not being two-dimensional, right? Like, it can play against that. It doesn't have to, but it can play against that.
The only time, other than, of course, we've all had evil campaigns, right, and so on and so forth, then you play more ubiquitous games like Vampire and stuff like that, then that changes things. Burning Wheel can go in interesting directions that are a little less prescriptive, but the only reason that I generally will do so with most, especially fantasy games, is because of a story arc. Like
Right.
I will allow somebody to start as the villain or start my character for Jamie's game
The Witch Hunter. Yeah.
was one of the bad guys.
Right.
And had,
Saw the error of that. In the past.
so the error of that. Well, more, I think for yours, they went from small case evil to capital case evil, like uppercase evil, and I was like, all right, I'm out, kind of idea.
Well, it's also like Finn in Star Wars, right? Like in the original trilogy, you would never have a stormtrooper, evolve into one of the good guys. The stormtroopers, and everybody on the Death Star was assumed to be evil. They didn't give a second thought. But then by the time, you get into these stories, the turn of the century, it's like, well, it does make sense that maybe one of these, stormtroopers kind of like tweaked out doing these evil things and said, oh, wait a minute, what am I doing? And then decided that...
Are we the
baddies?
Yeah. I do tend towards wanting to play heroic games, and then thus will say, all right, don't make an excuse to just be dumb. Don't make an excuse to just do crazy shit.
Yeah, I mean, in any case, it's when the alignment becomes an excuse to do things for the sake of doing them can become a problem.
I do appreciate the idea. I've seen this once or twice where someone's going to play chaotic neutral because they're like a chaos mage.
The guy who made all his decisions by rolling a die, who was playing a wild mage.
Was a wild mage.
Yeah.
And just the I'm embracing chaos. Magic is chaos. I'm all about the magic. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have to do the random shit.
Right.
It just means that if you think about like The Witcher, the mages are specifically reigning in chaos, right? And then the reason why you don't do fire magic is because it takes a toll, but it's like the ultimate form of chaos, kind of idea.
It can be a shorthand for the kind of story you want to participate in or tell. Also stories that becomes hard to tell if you restrict. A good example, like if you're trying to do a Peaky Blinders campaign, like what alignment would those characters be, right? Probably evil, but they have no problem. There's some loyalty issues between them or whatever, but for the most part, like there's no PvP between the Peaky Blind, like they're like on the same team. And so,
then you get into like crews and stuff like that. I think you probably have to have subsystems if you're going to lean into stuff like that. I think you have to have subsystems like an honor amongst thieves, right? If you're going to do a thief campaign,
your bond too, your personality traits. A bond could be a guy.
Oh, right. Bonds and motivation and personality and flaw, right?
Yes, and kind of goes back to those virtues too. So if you want to apply those to your character,
or some sort of like honor amongst thieves, right? The best example I can think of is like the Pirates Code.
Sure.
You know what I mean?
Guidelines.
They're just... But I mean, they're just like...
Parlay.
They're murdering people and stealing shit, but they do have a code, and then because they're trying to not devolve into chaos, they're trying to not just be murdering those,
Yeah,
it's funny in that meme where we're talking about Jack Sparrow was chaotic neutral.
Chaotic neutral, right?
Sure, that makes sense. I think I've run and played in a lot of campaigns that started out as what people would call evil campaigns, where it was like pirates or outsiders, brigands, whatever, thieving guild, whatever it is. And yet by the end of it, they wind up being, at least in some perspective, the heroes, but it's not by virtue of them saying we want to be good, but almost circumstances force them to be. And just thinking about a good example is the Witch Hunters. The characters did not start out saying we want to be rebels or we want to even fight. It's just the Witch Hunters themselves kept being such terrible shit that it was like, well, we have to deal with this. We have to deal with this.
You're bringing up a good point because, you're an introspective person. I'm sure you recognize this, but I want to point out the sheer power the GM has in terms of framing these things.
Right.
We talked, of course, earlier that they were the arbiter of what was good and evil.
Right. Yeah, I say that. Yeah.
But quite honestly, even what you're saying, the GM is very much driving the story. And while you may even eschew the idea of alignment, the idea of the GM is putting some sort of obstacle in front of the player characters, and by and large that's going to be deemed as bad, right, and
or a challenge or a puzzle to get. Because I think that's what I think about it. You know what I mean? Like,
but if you think about it though, like, by and large, we're going to tell moralistic tales, right? By and large, we're somewhere between moralistic and ethical. And I'll tell you why. Because we're not assholes or insane, right? So...
That's what you ask.
I mean, if you think about it, like, most of us are going to... unless we're sociopaths, we're going to feel uncomfortable even creating situations which the obstacle in front of them is some dotting little old lady, you know what I mean, who just wants to knit or whatever the case is. Like, we're just wired to create villains.
If it's framed the right way. Baldur's Gate 3 does a really good job of this, where they allow you to be evil. They make it really not fun. Like, I mean, some people do like to be a dirge and just murder everyone, but I've tried to do a Dark Urge playthrough several times. There's always some point where it's just like, no, I have to go against... Yeah, it's usually when I have to murder lesbians. But no, I'll kill everyone else, but the wonderful lesbian couple, they get to go on, and like, no, I'm not doing that.
No, they're going. And it's funny because my daughter plays that game all the time, and she's always playing the Dark Urge,
right? And
but then cheating so that she can just wipe everybody out. She doesn't have to be attacked. So I'm gonna do that. Says something.
Watch her. That's what they worry about, man.
But actually, I want to harken back into when you were the game master, and and then just sort of putting those, like you said, moralistic sort of. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, challenges in front of you. I definitely don't want to get through this podcast without pointing out the time when we had a menu and werebore was on the menu, and my character just said, I'll have the werebore. And, oh no, you were another player character. You were the DM. Jane was the DM.
Was me,
And you as a player character turned to my character and said, Do you have a habit of eating sentient beings? And I'll tell you what, as a player, and just the fact that I'm bringing this up, that stuck with me because that was a mistake. Like, I was like, I didn't mean to do that. But it
was a devil who designed the menu. So made perfect sense. Like, it's a word boar. It's fine. It's just like eating a boar.
It's just like bacon,
Just because it's where bacon, it's lawn bacon.
I'm sure some people are yelling at us right now, just saying, "Well, it's no different than eating the bacon."
Right. Yeah.
Which, come from your perspective, I have a lot of conversations about, man, now how sentient are pigs? How sentient are these animals?
Yeah, fairly.
It's like,
I think it's an
unfortunate for them; they're so delicious.
Right. Unfortunately, I think it's really interesting to play with that idea again instead of avoiding it, to lean into it. Like, I want to play or run a lawful good character whose government is corrupt,
right?
And how do you manage that? Because you think there is order, and then clearly the way towards order is to take down the bad order.
Or a paladin whose order, they realize their paladin, their order is corrupt.
Their order is corrupt.
Well, they have to follow the laws, and then what happens when those laws are forcing you to do things that are evil?
Can you do it within... it's an interesting story to say, can you accomplish your goals within the realm, within the box, right? Can you, all right, well, we have to go, you see this all the time in procedurals is, well, one person wants to follow the rules and the other person's like, no, we can't just kill them. We have to go through the system and let the system.
And you got the cop who doesn't follow the rules.
Right. It's kind of good,
It's loose cannon.
But the idea of a lawful good, can you guys think of a quote unquote lawful good character who is a rebel, who's in a rebel perspective?
A lawful good character?
Yeah.
Like you pointed out, you're a rebel against the government. So that would be, a lawful good character would be one that's sort of following principles. But ultimately, the order of society has got to be broken.
I mean, if we take it really literally, Luke Skywalker is a rebel.
But is he lawful good?
Yes.
You'd say
I'd at least, yeah, I think
That's
so.
interesting.
I mean, maybe neutral good. This is another one that's kind of, it could be neutral good too, because he's kind of a little less, but
Yeah, that's true. Luke is, because the everyman is sort of a difficult person to
Right.
nail down in general. I think, right?
especially
Like,
in a sort of nascent state in the first movie, he's kind of, like very impressionable by what's around him.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Well, and
So-
that started off as a dichotomy of, Jedi versus Sith, the good versus
Right.
the evil. And I think that it started to blend a little bit more. But, as that world's expanded, the Empire and, ultimately Anakin Skywalker's rationale for order and control, and
Right.
this is sort of the politic of it, it's just like Anakin saying, well, if we know what's right, what's going to make the society ordered, we should make people do those things. And, and it's just the making people do things,
Right. And the
and
Empire
being
is definitely
in
law.
control of the Empire.
It's definitely the
right, is the
lawful
law.
side. Yeah.
And so the rebellion then becomes the lawful good.
And they're based on what the Vietnamese, I'm forgetting the name of the
Viet Cong?
Viet Cong. Yeah. The rebels were definitely like chaos,
was the
oriented.
Fremen and Dune, also the same
Sure.
thing. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? Like, yeah.
It's an interesting idea of like, okay, so if you look at lawful evil, first off, just law at all costs becomes obvious, right?
Right.
But then you get into this idea of like, if you're only going to use law for your own benefit, right? Are you then following the law? You know what I mean? Like, granted, you could make laws that are to your benefit, but then are you really following the law? And I think that's where we get into interpretation.
This is the discussion I like having at the table, because the lawful evil character is honorable, right? So it's the evil paladin is like, if you fall off your horse, the evil paladin's going to get off his horse as well.
Right.
And in the interest of, being a servant of the undead deity god, whatever that is, but still going to follow the rules of engagement and be honorable in the interactions, you know what I mean? And I think that's an interesting character to play.
One of my Burning Wheel players made an orc in the human society, and orcs and Burning Wheel are very complicated, but they come from a very brutal society. And he took a really interesting tack on the idea of it, very much like a lawful evil kind of character, but the idea was like kind of a predator-like competition where it's I'm against myself, and like I have to challenge myself constantly, and these other people are ostensibly my hunting tools, right? He called them his things. The other player characters.
Right.
And the interesting thing when you say that is this idea of like, I'm not going to just murder them in their sleep because they're useful or beneath me. Like, those are the two options, right? Because I'm so awesome. Everything is just useful or beneath me. So only things that are potentially greater than me are worth my energy. Well, a really interesting take on like the idea
It was
of
very egotistical.
yeah, of lawful evil.
Yeah. I can think of some real world characters in that.
But again, like selfishness is something that I don't ascribe to law, right? So there's a difference between lawful and couching something in the law. Just because you're using the word law does not make you lawful.
No, but law isn't inherently good also. So, that's
But
a
it's-
complication.
But it's order.
Yeah.
What I'm trying to say is like people who act selfishly are not acting towards order is my point, right? So it's like you're not being
Although,
orderly.
I mean, to use
You're not being lawful.
to use the Empire as an example again in Star Wars, like maybe Darth Vader or like the Emperor are being selfish, but like the average stormtrooper or the average person in the empire who's serving the empire is quote unquote evil and, whatever, but like they're following the law.
Serving the evil cause,
Right.
but following the law. Yeah.
Yeah. Like they're not motivated by selfishness, but they're still,
Well, and I would say
Andor does this well with some other characters in Andor who are like not.
Oh yeah,
Well, like
I would say stormtroopers were lawful, but Darth Vader is not lawful.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't call Darth Vader lawful evil.
And this is a good example of yet again the problem of interpretation with alignment. If you try to get too specific about it and kind of lock things down with it, there's always exceptions.
Well,
always
this was
edge
the
cases,
problem. Right? If you and I took the same information and just went in opposite directions. You said alignment's stupid, fuck alignment, and then just moved on. Right?
Sort of, yeah.
That's
still
I'm not saying you don't use it at all, but I'm just saying, like, and I went, no, we're just going to make alignment useful. We're going to systematize it.
Right. Do you want to talk about the cosmology element now? I think this might be a good point to transition into it.
I think it might also give some clarity too, because
Right.
That's what I'm thinking. I think it is possible then to define, Darth Vader as lawful evil when, or even, and maybe it's helpful in the cosmology too of having the axis of lawful versus chaotic on one side and good versus evil. Because you're trying to talk about selfishness, which if it's in the interest of power, if it's in the interest of, your own wealth, if it's the interest, and not the interest of greater good in others, and that's an evil thing. That's not a lawful versus chaotic thing. That's a good versus evil thing.
The definition of law is order versus self, is society versus self.
Assuming that the law is in the best interest for society.
No. It doesn't have to be in the best interest of society, but it's made for society. So the lawful character, by my interpretation, that's what we're talking about. From a lot of my readings were the idea of the group versus the one, right? Chaos is about.
I usually do think of chaos as being more about individuality.
About individuality, where law is about society, is about a group of individuals all adhering to a structure, right? And people who are, for their own benefit, using that structure are not lawful. They're actively working against the structure.
My thing would be, it depends on how they're using it. Like they could be selfishly motivated, using the law to benefit themselves, but they are actually using the law and not bending the law.
Yeah, and for me, the law is just the structure, right? So the structure could be aligned to evil, right? The structure could be aligned to the selfishness of an individual. Like if the law is all things should be in the service of the emperor, then it's still lawful, but everything's in the service of the emperor.
But then I would say the emperor is not being lawful because the emperor is not serving society.
The emperor might not be lawful. It's the Sith Lord.
Is lawful.
No, it's the Sith Lord who follows him is lawful.
Right,
because he's following the law.
Well,
yeah. So
that's what I'm trying to say is, like, I think we see lawful evil sometimes as being that is using laws to subjugate people. And I don't necessarily, I think, for instance, our system is lawful evil. Like we have a lawful evil system.
Right.
Because it is literally designed, and I don't feel like I'm being very political, it's literally designed to make certain people more rich.
And to extract.
To extract and to exploit.
Right.
Like
through a series of laws.
Like consumerism, capitalism is that's what it's completely based on. And it is a system, right? It's a system doing those things. I don't think the people that it's benefiting are necessarily lawful. And I would say that they're not, because very often they see themselves as above the law. And I feel like that's a particularly chaotic thing to do.
Right. Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with that. I don't think. It gets tricky, though, when we start talking about the D&D cosmology, where it's actually not figuratively like just lawfulness being representative of society, but there's actually an entire dimension that is lawful good. There's an entire dimension that is neutral good or evil or whatever, and that's both really interesting to me in a fantastical sense.
Well, it's not both those things.
It's also incoherent, which
I mean, or an entire plane that's both lawful and good, where it meets the crossroads of lawful and good. But there's also, so we're talking about the cosmology of the planes, and this is why I think in D&D at least, alignment is inextricable. Because the entire cosmology is based off of the 9 alignments.
Right. The outer planes are based on the alignments.
And the outer planes, and then the deities by extension of those planes. But to that point, there is just a chaotic realm, right, limbo, and there is just a lawful realm and mechanus, which is neither good nor evil, right? Both of those are neutral,
right,
in that sense. And then similarly with, there's a purely good plane and a purely evil plane. Yeah, I'd have to look at it, Elysium, and then I think on either side of that, and one really interesting way to think about it for D&D is the battle between devils and demons.
Sure,
right. Both of them are evil,
and that's actually one of my favorite conflicts to use in D&D. Is the blood war.
The devils are lawful, the demons are chaotic.
Right.
And they are at war with each other over the minions, over the, I don't want to say the realms of evil, all of those planes, and, sticking with their nature of being lawful.
And an economy of souls also, which is...
Yeah, but then it comes out in the devils are an organized army, right? They've got a hierarchy, they've got leaders that they follow and things like that. Whereas the demons are chaotic and they are... just the horde, and they eat their own, and they've got none of that.
Although they
structure.
do, all right. So I hear what you're saying, and I'm going to then double down and say yes, because that's then later on in my gaming life how I used alignment is to understand the most important thing is when you die, where do you go? Okay. Now, however, what you're both saying then denies the idea of behavioral patterns tied to alignment. What that says is it does not matter how you act. Those people in all of those planes have full agency. They are maybe repercussions based on some sort of social dynamic, but they could do whatever the fuck they want to. It just so happens that there is a little corner of the multiverse that then your soul is inextricably linked to. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Which is very interesting because...
Well, I think Valhalla is one of them, right? And it's like, it's a chaotic good realm of combat, right? And, if you live your life that way, you're rewarded by going there.
So, interestingly enough, really, if you have to think about it, what you have to do is sort of think about it as not using the very charged words of alignment. It might as well be, Ishkalbittle, Puppyfoot plane. Right, because you have to remove this concept of behavior from that.
I think you're saying. I understand what you're saying. It's more the descriptive, versus prescriptive way of sort of saying like.
Right, it's super prescriptive.
Right,
it's not descriptive at all. Mm-hmm. Right, exactly.
You are aligning to this alignment, which is a bad way of framing it. But once you put yourself in there, once you've defined yourself as a devil, you have no choice but to be this thing.
Right. And it does. And that's sort of like when you see any of these like angels versus demons sort of thing, right? And they play like with good omens, right? And they play with the idea of what is good and evil.
Sure.
Why are they damned? Why are they not? Yada, yada. And it ultimately has to do with what side you pick. And I think that's sort of like an interesting reimagination of alignment because our brains are too hooked into those two words.
Good and evil, you mean?
Good and evil in long chaos.
Sure.
Like it's a chaotic good, plane. Like good and chaos have nothing to do with the chaotic good plane.
I mean, it's funny though because we were talking before about background in philosophy and so on. There's something in this that's very deeply Platonic in the sense of the forms and the idea of there being these sort of realms or embodiments of virtues or qualities that are
the
more
ideal form,
right? That are more pure than they could possibly be in our world and the material presence. So it's like the hells, for instance, are like the embodiment of that quality that's in the world, but it's like the nth degree embodiment of it. And
Right.
so as a concept, I find it really interesting, although a lot of times it becomes problematic when you start playing it out, like we've discussed,
Yeah, and Socrates, by extension of Plato, or Plato's extension of Socrates, would say that those ideal forms are out there, but they're not something that are tangible to us.
Right.
Or
but
attainable.
but they do
Or
exist.
exactly.
Right. That, you would never be, have that light shine on them. I always think about the horse. There's an ideal of a
Yes,
horse.
yeah.
For some reason, in philosophy, it's always a table. Everyone's always discussing a table. Is the table real? Table not real? Is the table good?
And table. And Jamie, I have to say this playing table here is probably pretty close to this fold out table that we can play games on. But yeah, I think that's definitely
and it brings to like this interesting idea of divinity, right? This interesting idea of like the ideal demon. You know what I mean? And it's like, it'd be an interesting like monologue of some creature to be like, you can't be me. Like, you can't ever aspire to be me because I'm born there. You're born on the prematerial plane. You're just a reflection of my
there's a purity argument. There's a purity argument.
And it's funny that is a way that allows me to sort of grasp deities in a D&D setting and play with them, because there are sort of always ideas that I have as a person about religion, which kind of complicate that. But when I make it about this sort of embodiment of these places, it becomes easier for me to wrap my head around somehow. Or it's like the deity is, the deities have motivations, but in a way they're so contingent on the quality of those realms that they don't have agency in the way that people do. Angels are also like, they don't have agency in the way people do, because there's so much that. There's no choice
the planes.
involved.
It's the alignment.
Right.
I mean, and for good or ill, and again, this is probably a crutch, but when you think about those deities, whether it's Paladin or Tychesis, or those kind of things, there's sort of the embodiment of them. But for me, they become just largely the North Star for that alignment, right?
Exactly,
There's no description of why Paladin was lawful good, or behemoth, right? Like, what did he do in the past that made him lawful good? No, he just came from the plane, and he is the embodiment of lawful good.
Right.
It has nothing to do with his, with his
quite
behavior.
Honestly, it's like it does create that an angel or a deva or a solar, like if we want to stick to D&D terms, can do anything in the, can take ostensibly any action in service of their deity. And as long as that deity is okay with that, it doesn't matter what it is, and consequently that's true for everybody. Yeah. You can have a dretch helping little old ladies across the street, and as long as whoever the Cambion is the power that be over that dretch, which shouldn't be because it's not lawful, as long as they're okay with it, that dretch can live his happy little life helping old ladies across the street, and he's still chaotic.
It's just fooling the people.
It's just chaotic evil. Like, he can't help but being chaotic evil. And that's an interesting idea, because then you're like, well, wait a minute. Then we take that idea and say, can you change it? And how?
And those become the exception, right? I do want to call that out too. It becomes a thing then when somebody does migrate from one to the other, right?
Zariel comes to mind.
Right, that's exactly what I was saying.
It's a fallen angel who winds up serving the legions of the devils, and I always see her almost like
she was a solar.
I don't know what kind of angel. She was like some sort of, I think, even greater than a solar, I think.
Or archangel, or diva,
but I kind of think almost like Colonel Kurtz, where it's like she was part of the Blood War, and was like, this doesn't make any sense. We're just fighting this thing the same way, and it's not working. We got to do this the right way and like get this thing done. And as a result of that, like fell because she like went too far,
Right.
Which is interesting because you see that in like Constantine, right? The movie but if you think about it though, that's kind of what Gabriel is doing, but really was ultimately a selfish act, right? And interestingly, that's where that departure comes from, is the idea of like, they're no longer serving the person Right. So it's like, where is that line? And that line, we joke and say that alignment is interpretive, but the interesting thing is in the scope of D&D, it literally is interpretive. It's interpretive, but you're the GM by and large, and sometimes a group, depending upon your group, is interpreting the gods.
Right.
And you know what I mean?
It would be permissible. Yeah.
You know, it's like there is no, I tend to sometimes take it as like, I'll do a checklist and be like, you know, again, you have a choice. And I might even tell a player on the other end of the spectrum, forget cosmology. I'll even tell a player, like, you're going to roll this. If you fail, you may change alignment. If you do this, it turns out, the consequences, turns out you're doing this for the wrong reason, you know, kind of idea, and make it a thing. But
and then do they have to play their character that way from then on?
right, exactly. That's or like, are they then redeeming themselves, or whatever the case is? There's a story game called Paladin, which is literally about that. It's literally about a fallen paladin who then has to redeem himself.
Oh, cool.
It was like, that's an awesome story just in its own right, you know, and that's why it's a story game.
Right.
A very small game. It's awesome, but it is just funny that we're saying that, yes, alignment's this interpretive thing, and how do you interpret law and how do you interpret chaos, when really when it comes down to it, you're not having to interpret an objective thing. We just have to interpret what we think a fictional
within the context of that world.
But also the interesting stories come in those characters that go against that, right? You know, we mentioned Zariel. Dritz is another one, right? Like that was sort of the idea of like having the drow be potentially chaotic good, you know, and we were talking on the cosmology of angels and demons. There's a lot of stories out now that I find really interesting when you take, you know, like Lucifer.
Right.
Like Lucifer Morningstar, the comic book character, and then the series, you know, of like redeeming that character in the Christian mythology.
Sure.
You know, that you, again, it becomes interesting there of a character that has the trope of like, well, obviously Lucifer's evil, whatever that is. You know what I mean? Like, and, you know, and selfish and all of those things. But on the other hand, you know, here we're making this character then second guess, likable, certainly.
Or they have reasons for doing this. There's some stories, some myths about Lucifer and also Iblis in the kind of Muslim context where like the reasoning for making that choice makes it at least not evil, like question mark, you like you know, where it's like they love God too much, you know, it's like I love God too much to go to like, you know, put man before them, that sort of thing. Like,
well, that was their original sin,
right? Exactly. Like you know, so there's
yeah.
different sort of motivations there. I just think it's interesting. You can take, you know, any sort of evil character like that and put a twist on it if they have a motivation that shines a different light on it. I mean, that's, you know,
think about that would be an interesting story, right? Because we talk about the redemption arc, right? And that's a pretty standard, I think, good, solid story.
Sure.
But think about the idea of like, what happens when a demon starts being too good?
right.
Like, what do they have to do? And like, do you have to, like, a story of like, do I have to defect? Can I go somewhere else? Will somebody else take me? What's that mean for my soul? Like, what, you know, and that brings a lot more weight into this idea of, so the demon war and devil war, right?
Right.
It's one thing. The blood war is one thing, right? But look at that in terms of all of the planes of like everybody vying for souls.
Right.
Then everybody vying for like, okay, yeah, sure, come on over. Yeah, you have to do a few things for us, but you know,
They just all ask for different signs of, you know
what,
alignment.
Do a good job, right? You know, do a good job with that is like the faction game in Blades.
Oh yeah.
You know, is that you could play if you're gonna play a multiplanar game. It would be interesting to
make the alignment a faction.
To make alignment a faction.
Because you were saying it's like teams, and it can be. I mean, it can definitely play out that way.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, because then you do certain things that, you know, that alienate one, and
yeah, that's kind of cool. That could be interesting.
But yeah, my biggest thing now, unless I really want to play with it, is that it does not really matter until you die. And when your character dies, you show up in a plane. And that's kind of a fun thing to me, is like, death is not the end.
Right.
And, you know, well, what happens when the paladin goes to, I forget, the lawful good plane?
Celestia, I don't know.
Something like that. Goes there, and like their buddies come to get him and be like, I don't want to go anywhere. This place is great. You guys are assholes to me all the time. You know?
Yeah, that's also one of the things that
I'm making so much noise.
There's so many opportunities for a character to die, to go to a plane, and for it to become part of an adventure. But the way it usually plays out in D&D, I think, is oftentimes where I cast a spell, or I go to the temple and spend 500 gold pieces, and they come back, and, you know, maybe as flavor, you know, I was on a field where there are people dancing around or whatever. But there's so many possibilities of it actually being like possibly even the entrance into the characters first going to the outer planes, or even discovering that there are outer planes, possibly, depending.
I always love, even, I think I told you guys this, like, one of my sort of most iconic characters died, and the wizard actually rose, like, brought me back to life. I forget what wizard spell could do that, you know.
Some wish.
Oh, no, reincarnation.
No, lower.
But you wind up in a different body.
Slightly lower level. So but it was a wizard spell, and it was important because then I started following that character as a god. Like, this is my personal deed.
He brought you back.
You brought me back. Like, you know what I mean? God knows where I was, but it wasn't pleasant.
But then there is the reincarnation idea too,
right?
Like that you're coming back,
totally
touches something different.
Yeah.
But implications.
Is that still
from
in
your
5e?
previous
I can't remember.
life.
I know it was a big part of
so,
early.
yeah.
That's the sort of thing they've kind of phased out of 5e, are like permanent shifts like that. Where it used to be really common, where it's like, okay, now you're a centaur, you know.
But I've talked about it. The 5e Planescape has you roll up 4 characters, and if you die in a session, you have to come back. You're still the same spirit, but you're a different species and class.
Oh, 1 and 4. Oh, that's interesting. So there's like a Nirvana wheel kind of.
Yeah.
That's kind of fun.
No, you're in a
that's very fallen cycle.
You're in an outer plane.
Yeah.
But you could certainly play with the alignment with those characters too, or at least there being repercussions from one to the next. I haven't played that yet. I'm excited to play it, but I think then there's sort of a reveal at the end of like your true nature, from before you got to the outer planes. Yeah,
that's cool.
Yeah.
So this is probably one of our most contentious topics.
Sort of, yeah.
Does anybody's opinions at all changed from this? Are we still in the same camp we were starting off?
No, I mean, I certainly can see the value of having a descriptive rationale for what you would call alignment, or just being relativistic in a sense that you don't want to have to stick to that alignment in the story. So for the sake of the narrative, for the sake of the story, for the sake of character arcs, right, when you're thinking about it from a narrative point of view, then it is more interesting for characters to be more fluid, and than to have that rigid alignment. But I'm not convinced to get away from it, because I like these conversations that we have about alignment at the table, as much as you probably don't like to spend the time. But when you get into, if me as a DM, decides to, use alignment and to start to either be punitive, the carrot and stick, it introduces those conversations at the table about, just like we had, what is lawful? What do you mean I'm not being in my alignment, right? I think that, and here's why I justify my players' actions, or really just with every decision that you make has got an ethical, moral component to it, where it's like, am I doing the right thing by my character, and this is what's going to steer me towards it. Whereas if you don't address it and you think about it from relativistic terms, or you don't define it at the outset, it just sort of gets lost in the ether. It's not something specific from an ethics perspective that you're focusing on, to be able to have that conversation at the table.
I do think it's interesting that so many of the systems, or at least ostensible systems, behind alignment have been removed, and yet alignment is so still intrinsic to the cosmology and to the framing of the world and the gods and so on, where, I don't know if I've encountered it as an actual problem in games I've run or played in, but it is still funny. There isn't really a system in tracking alignment or in, sort of managing these things when it is in the background of the universe, the multiverse, whatever you want to call it. It's just funny.
It makes me want to play or run a campaign, obviously, where you don't know what your alignment is. Like, we don't know that. We don't know where we're going, and your behavior, as per many, many, many spiritualities, your behavior does not dictate that.
Right.
I think that's what that Planescape game is about, because you're appearing with amnesia, right? So you were a character before appearing there. You morph into these different forms, and then finally it's revealed what you were truly, or what you were previously. Yeah, but that could be the starting point of, like, you've got amnesia, you don't know anything about who you are. Now you've got to try and figure that out. Right. I think that is an interesting.
But like, quite honestly, like, we're not born caring. Right? Eventually we do, and other people try to bring us into that idea. And if you think about, for your games, if you think about that in terms of, like, your characters are just trumping through the world, and they might think, where do I belong in it? They might think, I hear there's all of these different places, but of course there's people in their ears saying this one's better than this one. And,
right.
But then, like, what happens when you go to a soothsayer and she reads your cards? Hey, stay tuned, by the way, for our tarot conversation.
Yeah, that'll be fun.
Later on. But she reads your cards, and you discover in that reading that you're actually lawful neutral. How does that change you? Do you start acting differently? Do you
push against it?
Do you go to push against? Do you go to a church of mechanists and try to look into this idea of, like, what the fuck is going to happen to you when you die? These are worlds where it's kind of hard to ignore the idea of an afterlife.
Right.
Right. So now you're like, okay, so lean into that. Right. You don't necessarily have to do it a planar game.
Right.
I feel like all of our games sort of, like, start spinning off to the, like, all right, we're getting in the ship and going somewhere.
Yeah. I'm definitely a fan of Planescape and of just the kind of concept of the outer planes and, well, just all the planes. But it's funny because it does replicate the style and also ultimately problem of a lot of old sci-fi, Star Trek being a good example of where you have the planet of people who are like this. You have the planet of the people who are all like this.
Oh, God.
Right.
I hate those
monocultures. Right, exactly. But the planes are kind of that way as portrayed in it. And this is also why there's so much more lore about the hells and the abysses and stuff than about the upper planes. You usually get like a paragraph about a listing, like, oh, it's a nice place. There's trees and you're all happy. Okay, anyways, here's a place where your flesh is melting, and, like, here's 30 pages.
And on the 7th layer of hell.
Yeah. And of course, part of that is because you're oriented towards those being the baddies that you're going to be fighting, so you care more about them or whatever. But it is interesting that where the lore tends to kind of accumulate and where it doesnn't, and kind of what that says about the priorities of the cosmology itself.
You're far more likely to visit the abyss than you are to visit anywhere else.
Or for it to matter, for it to be more than just a cutscene of, like, this is an idyllic place that's very nice and everyone's nice to each other.
Well, and that's what we were kind of saying. Didn't they do that in He-Man? Didn't they die in the most recent He-Man?
I haven't seen it, so I can't say.
Oh, really? Oh,
the movie?
No, the series.
Oh, no.
It was actually pretty interesting, where basically they died and to, like,
that would make sense because Skeletor's a skeleton.
Right. And went to, like, hey, spoiler alert.
Logical.
So, they died and went to ostensibly their heaven.
Spoiler alert, Skeletor's a skeleton.
I
just ruined the movie that's coming out this year.
He fooled you with those muscles.
And it's Jared Leto.
But yeah, and then they had to, like, figure out a way to get back. And I, like, thinking about that now, it's like, this is a cool place and there's reasons to go to those planes, But as I was saying earlier, like, it's hard. It would be hard as a GM to be like, all right, well, there's this really cute puppy. What are you going to do?
Right.
Yeah. We're going to kick it. All right. Roll.
Yeah.
You know? Like, who wants to run that game?
Exactly.
I don't want to know you. Don't answer.
It's not a
Right.
puppy, it's a cat, and any options are open. Unfortunately.
I have the opposite opinion. If someone kicks a cat, then like they have to be murdered.
Yeah, that's what I mean. While we may say that we're going to run like, you know, an evil game or an ambiguous game,
Right.
whatever the case is, our characters ultimately end up being good guys because we don't want to watch them do really shitty things. Don't get me wrong. There was a great show in the 80s. I can't remember what it was called. The actor's name is Adrian. He was in Heroes. He was like the brother in Heroes.
Oh, yeah.
And he played Prophet. That was the name of the show. And it's basically about a guy who wakes up with amnesia, like tabula rasa, and it turns out that like he was an executive in this company and he has to like make his way back. And ultimately he does really shitty things to people. You know what I mean? To get back. To some degree, like, after a while in the Saw series, you're kind of rooting for the Saw guy, you know? To some degree, you know? And, yeah, because you want to see what crazy shit that he does to people. But, like...
We didn't talk about that, but I one of the fascinating things I like about narratives coming out of the 90s is the flip of making the, you know, what would historically be the antagonist, the protagonist.
Right.
You know, my favorite being natural born killers. You know what I mean? Like
Sure.
the serial killers and the people that you're rooting for.
I wasn't rooting for them.
Yeah.
Well, the thing about that was the way they framed it in the movie that was interesting is you're not, well, I don't know if I say rooting for them, but it's like they had to kind of suffer at the end. It was required by the sort of like...
Well, they are the protagonists of the story.
Yes,
Well, I mean, a lot of people took issue with
I hate Juliette Lewis as an actress.
the violence of the movie.
I love that movie. That was definitely one of my favorites.
Really?
In the 90s. Yeah. That's one of my favorite movies in the 90s.
Oliver Stone and you know,
That and 12 Monkeys were definitely in the top
12
10.
Monkeys, so yeah.
12 Monkeys is great, but and my favorite time travel movie. But what's the other? Oh, The Sopranos. You know, we
Sure.
talked about
Sopranos, right.
you know Sopranos.
Right, about Peaky Blinders.
You know, yeah. I mean, these guys are
You know, House
normally the
Ranch
bad
in
guys.
Deadwood.
You know?
Like, you know what I mean? It's just easily the main character. And,
Yeah.
you know, while he does things that are good, quote unquote, you know, he's still a bastard.
There's not a system for this, but I do think it's interesting that, like, we're talking about crews and about like how a crew can be good with each other even though they're evil. Also, like soldiers, same thing. Like, you're fighting for the guy next to you. You're not fighting for the cause, even, you know, ultimately. Amos, as a character, another example of this, where you have someone who, in a different circumstance, they would probably be quote unquote evil.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Polo
But like,
and Titus.
yeah, exactly. And like, so I think a lot of times it is also that sort of context of the group that you're with. And in RPGs, especially a game like D&D, where there's this idea of the party, it's almost like the party alignment in a way becomes a thing, even though it's not defined really. There isn't like a party alignment, but there is kind of.
It
like
can be defined too, because I have
I guess it could be.
just to be like,
Yeah.
this needs to be consistent.
But it's not at least like usually formalized in the books, you know.
They're the third, I think, or third. One of the editions of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay was done by... It was designed by Chris Promise, but I don't think it was under Green Ronin. I think it was under Fantasy Flight, if I'm not mistaken. It was one of their first games with like the special dice. But they had a group, it's sort of like in Otherscape, right? It was like you picked what type of group you were, and that those different groups had different powers. And you could like level or like advance you through experience and such, your group powers and so on and so forth. And you do things
That were based upon like what your identity as a group was.
yeah, what your identity as a group was. Yeah,
That's cool.
It's pretty interesting. But yeah, I like the idea of, and that would be interesting, right? It makes a lot more sense to be like, all right, well, you could be whatever alignment you want, but the group is going to be neutral good.
Right.
You know what I mean? And like, there would be points of conflict that are
Right, because that makes almost like your ideals in a way as a group. You know, like someone might act against it, but then that becomes kind of within the group. There might be some contention about that. You know,
like I think Leverage might be a little too like PG in terms of like good guys, bad guys, but you have a thief and a hacker and you know what I mean, and a con artist, right? Granted, they all have hearts of gold, you know, but you know they're all go to lengths for each other and so on and so forth. Almost like the perfect group movie, group show.
But they're chaotic.
Yeah, absolutely chaotic. Absolutely
chaotic good.
Yeah. You know, that's where we didn't really get into the interpretive piece too much, but what's good and what's evil is
that's such a can of worms.
It's entire coursework, right? So it's
yeah.
That's definitely one of those things where if you don't look too close at it, you're like, I know what good and bad is. What are you talking about? And then the second you start looking at it, it becomes more and more.
And that's when you throw the trolley problem in.
Right, exactly, exactly. Have you seen The Good Place?
Yeah.
I mean, they literally throw the trolley problem at them, but there's elements of that show definitely that remind me of RPGs, like a lot of the scenarios that they get thrown into and so on. Like, you know,
and they've got the planes in there too.
Right, it's true. Yeah.
Well, heaven and hell.
You are reborn, but not freed. Returning eternally to a life not unlike the one you've always lived, with the memory of it stripped away. Then you start to remember. Maybe you've been having prophetic dreams that won't stop, or you hear the spirits of the trees demanding your blood whenever you step outside your apartment door. But those are just dreams, right? Many cycles begin in a world like ours, with people who know only their waking lives. Gradually, a crack opens between the mundane and the fantastic, the wondrous and the horrific, the past and the future, revealing that beyond this world lie 3 realms, and between them a quiet war stretches through the ages, the light of remembrance set against the dark of forgetting. Many entrances, no exits. Enter the Fallen Cycle at fallencycle.com.
Right, so we want to talk about a practical approach on how to apply these things in our games, right? Or how to at least sort them out with our player characters.
We hinted at it, but
without just simply giving them this podcast and say, listen to this podcast.
Which you should also do.
In addition to that,
If you can find, I think there's a difference between, there's practical and what matters, right? What is going to hit the table is really the important piece. I don't feel like, and please correct me if I'm wrong, if you think I'm wrong, I don't feel like alignment should be a big part of your game if it's not going to matter. If you're not going to play with alignment, if it's not going to really play a big role in your stories, why does it matter?
Yeah, usually that's sort of like a vestigial thing you write on your character sheet and then don't talk about it.
Right.
You know?
Do you agree? I mean,
I suppose, but I'm like, why wouldn't you include it, right? And maybe for a shorter, for a shorter session where it's not going to come up, and it's not going to come up. It's just like not filling out the whole character sheet if you're not going to use the supplies, right? Like, so in that sense, I agree with you. But I think
don't get me into supplies.
Right. Well,
I'm a big loadout fan. Never mind coins. I never want to count coins, but that's a thing.
Right, exactly.
I think that's the important part, and that's actually the piece of the puzzle is don't use things you're not going to use. And don't get me wrong, it can be on the character sheet because it can be shorthand, and it could help a player think about
navigate a question they have to answer. Yeah.
But I wouldn't lean on it or really talk about it or anything to that effect if you're not going to have there be penalties or restrictions. Or if you're going to play a game where the planes matter and you're going to align your character to that plane, like, or like I was saying with, you know, how I would do it is have it be part of consequences. Have changing alignments mean something in the game. It could be I like the idea of like a faction game, you know.
Or it could be part of your class, like it's
part of your
important for a paladin, it's important for a
then
cleric,
I would absolutely,
but not important for a
right.
fighter, not important for, you know, a ranger maybe.
Right. And I want to say that I don't think 80% of the reason they stripped alignment, all of the alignment stuff out of the player's handbook, I don't believe was to say that those alignment things don't exist.
Right.
I think what they were trying to do, based on articles I've read and interviews I've heard, is to open it up and say it's up to your group to determine what those restrictions
and basically
are.
Officially kind of saying what was probably already happening at a lot of tables anyways was we're not going to do it that way. You know?
I mean, if you don't want the dwarves in your world to be able to cast arcane magic, then they don't.
Right. Yeah.
You know, there's nothing saying just because they allow, the player's handbook allows for dwarves to be sorcerers, doesn't mean you have to allow your dwarves to be sorcerers.
Yeah, I wonder if they got away from it because of what we touched on, some of those problematic tropes.
Well,
too, is just kind of being concerned about, hey, if you're this class, you know, or this species, then you tend to be towards this alignment, and then that became
for species,
probably got
not
that sense.
for class, really. I think, like I said, I can tell you from like actually interacting with some of those designers during 3E, which is where this stuff got decoupled.
Right. Yeah. What started there? Yeah.
It was because they wanted to open up to various different worlds and so on and so forth. And I don't remember where, but I remember very specifically them saying, in your world, maybe all paladins are lawful good, and maybe some dwarves can't be mages. Like, it was very, very clear. That was the thing.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, this is something I've been thinking about a lot in terms of creative projects. I've been thinking about it for years, but is that like restrictions are really important, and they define sort of the end result, as does freedom. I mean, the example that always comes to mind for me is, you know, the difference in just having a project where I'm inking it with a brush on paper versus where I'm inking it on a screen where I've got infinite undos and infinite layers. And there's pros and cons to either way. It's not like I think you're a better artist if you just do it on paper. It's, you know, but the same thing with like alignments or things like restrictions are important restrictions, but how to do it for a reason. Like if I'm doing a project where I'm doing it all by hand on paper, there's a reason why I'm doing that.
Yes.
You know, for the end project and what I think the end product is going to be like in terms of my goals for that project. Just like another project I might do where I'm like using all sorts of electronic music tricks and I'm, you know, using algorithms to write the chord patterns and stuff like that. I'll do that for certain projects where it makes sense. But for a project where I'm working on a folk album with someone, I'm not going to do that, you know? So it's, you know.
The arpeggiation.
Right,
arpeggios,
yeah.
I always feel some kind of way using those. Like, I'm not playing these notes.
Yes, yeah, I got
it's playing the notes for me.
Yeah.
I'm playing the chords.
I got past all that. I mean, you can always edit them out. I mean, usually I use it kind of like I use presets where I start out with that and then I modify it from the starting point. But nevertheless, it's still, you know, it's like, I think it's important to have limitations as long as you have a reason to do it. That's basically my thing on that.
I don't know if this helped with the practical aspect of it. You mentioned session 0. I think.
Well, hold on. I was going to do that last. So, you know, but tracking can be fun. I would suggest trying a descriptive method where you're actually tracking and having the grid and like having little pins move in directions.
Did evil check.
You know, that's what I do is I have things like, you know, I had a whole system involved with magic was chaos. So the mages really had to like do things towards law in order to not have the chaos run rampant every time they cast a spell. Right. You know, and that was like an interesting push-pull or something where like,
that is interesting.
Crap, I have to I have to go uphold this thing. I have to do this really lawful thing because I want to be a mage and I like chaos. You know?
The Defilers of Dark Sun were also very
Yes,
close to that.
yeah,
You know,
yeah.
You couldn't cast the most powerful magic without defiling the life of the land and everybody sort of calling you out as such.
I also want to suggest we talk about this idea of it being interpretive. I want to suggest that players don't choose their alignments, that it is interpretive, and in fact, again, this is where the faction, game would go, where your alignment is how other people see you, what your reputation is, how you act, and so on and so forth.
Well, that's interesting, having it as a reputation system. I mean, explicitly would be interesting.
And have, like, even the other player characters maybe will weigh in on maybe where you are.
Well, that'd be interesting, because normally I would think about that in terms of DM tracking, which is, a framework you could have of like, you might have this goal of being in this alignment, but here's where the DM has assessed you to be at actually, and then it's become sort of a mystery as to whether or not you're, on the right track.
It wouldn't surprise you to know if I was going to do something like that nowadays, it would be through a consequence of a roll or like a GM intrusion or something like that, where I would do that to push the player story-wise, right? But I wouldn't just do it because I know there's GMs out there who do it arbitrarily, basically just because they're doing it, whether it be a power trip or they have some moralistic idea of something or whatever the case is. I don't think I'm not that.
Yeah, I don't usually roll that way either.
Find mechanical ways, like find literally physical mechanical ways to track that stuff. Create tracks where things might move back and forth, or use tags or something to that effect that would allow players to kind of keep an easy track of that sort of thing.
And also I love systems where there's a pro and con to either side, where like for instance, like it was like, you're a demonologist wizard who you like deal with demons and conjure them or whatever. If you start dealing with them and become friendly with them, say, and you become more like them, there's a pro and con there. If you can bake it in. The same thing if you're trying to do it by controlling them and being, you're like lawful good or whatever. There could be interesting ways of doing that where you become potentially even more, you could actually gain demonic qualities, the character.
Necromancy and conjuring undead can be that way too.
Right, exactly.
Because generally it's sort of, necromancy is going to automatically be evil, conjuring undead. But then you make that, it depends on, how the characters...
And make sure that it's like fiction first and describe why it's evil or why it's chaotic, right? Like, how does this feel? What are you actually doing? Is it because you're binding some spirit to this dead body? How does the spirit feel? You need consequences. You need to I don't feel like using the alignments just as shorthand, right? Like bring those details into the game will make your alignments feel more real.
Sure.
But the most important thing, I think we're wrapping up, is to say session 0. Like talk to your players and your group and make these decisions together. What does alignment mean to all of you? Do you want to have those conversations at the table? I don't. So honestly, I don't mind having them offline, but make certain that there's no surprises, quite honestly. And if there are surprises, there should be an economy behind it, I believe. That there's a social contract to be created.
Right.
So to make sure everybody's having a good time.
Yeah. Right. Well, and we haven't touched on it, but, in real world terms, player terms, that session 0, it's important to talk about what are the things that players are comfortable with.
Yeah.
Because if you are going to get into, an evil campaign, or you're going to have characters at the table that are trying to function, as an evil, or whatever,
that's a good
or even your NPCs and your monsters, you just want to make sure that that's framed in the fictional world, and not going beyond the comfort zone of any one of the players at your table.
The big mistake Abed made is that he didn't do lines and veils before the campaign in Community.
He's kind of a terrible DM, but that's a whole different conversation.
But yeah,
so
so
literal.
no, absolutely. In fact, like some of that ends up being parts of lines and veils, right? Is somebody saying it doesn't just have to be like trauma based. It can be like,
Right.
look, I don't want PvP.
Right.
I want us
Exactly.
to be, something like Burning Wheel is very important to say none of our beliefs should work against each other's beliefs because we want to be working together towards a goal.
Or players can talk about how they would navigate different, because you can have characters with different beliefs where it's not necessarily driving towards a life and death conflict.
Right.
It's just kind of how do you plan to mitigate that?
Right. Again, it could be that like you can. Often we've said instead of a line, that player conflict is a veil.
Right.
Where it happens, like we'll have a little scene of somebody bickering,
Right.
but then it doesn't become an actual mechanical conflict.
Right. I mean, this is actually a thing. Like originally in Star Trek TNG, there was like a hard rule: there could be no conflict between the main characters.
Oh, really?
Which is one of Gene Roddenberry's like things, and they kind of phased it out. And then once he was out of the picture, they're like, no. But you still, I mean, in TNG, you don't see it, but you start seeing some conflict. And then DS9, they kind of went further. But they still, it was still very much, you don't have many situations that I can think of where it was like, what we'd call PvP, where, there's that one episode where Garak gets affected by a virus or something and becomes evil Garak, he tries to kill them.
No, that's true. Like, Quark and Odo are like rivals that spit on each other.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, they'll help each other.
Right. They're not trying to murder each other. Yeah,
What
exactly.
would Gene think of Data's full functionality?
That was like right away. That was like episode 2. That's a whole other thing. It's fine. I'm really the podcast, but the fact that they ran that as the second episode of the show is just so bonkers.
So just session 0 and have these conversations and don't surprise your players with this stuff, but like don't use it if you're not going to use it.
Right.
Don't lean on it. Don't worry too much about it. Don't go to your players and be like, oh, you can't do that. You're kind of good.
Mm-hmm.
If you haven't had that conversation.
Right.
I got you. But use it.
You have been listening to another episode of the Modern Mythology Podcast. We hope we gave you something new to think about that you can bring to your RPGs, writing, and other character-based games and art forms. Produced by James Kershaw. Soundtrack by Scott Landis and James Kershaw. For more information about this episode, articles, or links to our other related projects, visit modernmythology.net.